really impressed to see you all here. I mean, it's raining out, it's a dreary night, and then you made your way here, and you seem to be in good spirits. So I'm also happy to see Carol and to see what she's been able to build. I mean, I remember her talking about the museum when there was no museum and thinking, well, you know, good luck. but she did it. And here I am. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to try to go fast with this because I put 71 pictures, and it's going to take a little while. This is a view of Detroit that I encountered in 1991. There was a building there that used to be a former hotel in an area where now the stadium, the hockey stadium, is coming in. And all of this is going to be transformed. As you see, some of this empty land here is now very valuable because the city is expanding. There's a big developer there called Gilbert that has put billions of dollars into restoring some of the buildings and bringing back the downtown. Now Illich, which is another billionaire, it's making his site here, so all of this is going to be transformed. But my first encounter with Detroit, which really it happened in the late 60s, then again I went there in 81, then I went in 87. It impressed me tremendously, particularly having grown up in the country and seeing here buildings. This light is a pointer or not?
Yeah, sure.
Can you see it?
I don't know. It worked before.
Well, it doesn't matter.
Oh, the light. Sorry, I might not advance it.
Yeah.
Should.
Well, any case.
Point with your finger there.
Yeah, I'll do that. So what, you know, when you're looking, this was the second largest department store in the United States. This building here was vacant, completely vacant. There was the Hilton Hotel that was right around here, was empty. This building was empty. So I saw all these skyscrapers, you know. By the town I grew up, the tallest building was 4-story high. If I was taken to the Capitol by my mother, I used to look up. The buildings were 14-story high, and I thought they were immense. So here I am in Detroit, and there are these wonderful buildings, and they look wonderful. But they're abandoned, and they're silent, and they kind of stare at you, and you figure that your heart pumps, you know, and you look at it, you want to photograph it. But there is something about them. You find a tremendous beauty there, which at that time nobody shared. The whole idea of ruins was an idea that was very un-American. Like ruins could not exist in America. The idea was, particularly in Detroit, that Detroit was a place of progress. That Detroit is where the future was invented. So having this stuff was something like a nightmare that was just happening for a short period of time. But then they would say, come here next year. Or there would be somebody writing for the Free Press that always had $20 billion worth of investment that's coming in and it's going to be in this downtown. I even could tell the names. So let me go through. I came out with the idea, which Carol almost killed me for it, that they should have an acropolis. They should keep those abandoned skyscrapers as abandoned skyscrapers, and then people would come and look at them, and their spirits would be lifted by seeing so many ruins. And that made me famous for about 20 minutes. So this is basically what happens, you know, how the buildings kind of shed their skin. And the street below is, of course, you can't walk on the sidewalk because pieces have fallen and cars have been damaged. And of course, people could be damaged.
What building is that?
This is called the United Artists Building, and it had a great theater. It belongs to Illich now, which is one of the billionaires. That's a building that always captivated me. I think it's completely empty, but probably it's going to be fixed and it will be occupied. It's called the Book Building, and it was part of a street called Washington Street or Washington Avenue that then that it was supposed to be like the Park Avenue of Detroit, and this book family was very ambitious, and they wanted to. This building was supposed to be even much taller than it actually was. It's probably 33, 34 stories high. And I used to just go. I stayed in a building that was faced this, and I could go to the roof and photograph this top of that building and sort of fantasize about what drove people to build the building like that. And then the future of it, when it became true, it started acquiring all kinds of antennas and communication equipment, and then birds, there were falcons and so on. This was the top of another, and this Carol wouldn't call it a skyscraper. It's a building about 13, 14 story high. But that top, to me, was amazing. I mean, just stare at it. Wow. It's just, what were they thinking? And then again, be very happy that they actually built it. This building, it used to be the jewelry center of Detroit. And I tend to forget names and stuff, but they are all in the book. So it stayed empty for a long time, and then it's now going to be fixed. It's actually, it has asbestos. It had they put watches together there, and it had a lot of radiation and things like that. This is what the inside of one of the buildings that could have been seen at the beginning. This is what it looked like. There were maybe 20 dentists that had offices there, similar number of lawyers, and when they left all their stuff there. So when that book that caused a stir called The Ruins of Detroit in Ruins, or The Ruins of Detroit, what they found is it's a city where the interiors of the buildings were left as if the people had just been forced out by some kind of neutron bomb, was the favorite explanation. This is a man, he was part of a 15-man crew that took care of a skyscraper. His name was Willie. So one of my jobs was to go and find Willie, and he would usually be sitting down on the ground. There was a little restaurant still hanging on. Everything else was empty in the building. And slip $10 or $15, and he would take me up. And Willie had this little place where he would forage through the whole building and find the things that he liked, and he arranged this little office in the best tradition of the supers in New York. Again, extraordinary things happen in Detroit. This was a lumber baron's house on Alfred Street in Detroit, and I saw it first in 1987. This is one of the oldest pictures here in this show. So that picture is from 1987. And at one point, I just decided that's not going to make it. That's just doomed, that building. And then, again, the land around it started getting empty. And that's what it looks like today. And it's not only rebuilt and fixed in a pretty decent way, but also it has a blonde woman, a gentrifier there, and the whole area was full of homeless people that just live in the abandoned buildings and so on. And you wouldn't see the likes of her, roaming around the area. So this area is called Brush Park. What I want, and Gilbert, that has invested quite a bit of money in the downtown. Now it's spilling over to this area, which is immediately north of the downtown on the other side of the expressway. So this is an area of investment. Detroit has some extraordinary things. I think this is it's a conservatory in Belle Isle, and it was designed by Albert Kahn. And this is the building, of course, it's the sunrise. And that's why it's almost looking that way. It's a mansion built for the Fisher family in an area called Boston Edison. That's a decoration in a mansion that, even though it wasn't built for him, but it's called the Gordy Mansion, or the Motown Mansion, because Barry Gordy lived there. I was very happy to recently be in London and seeing figures like this in some of the really fancy areas of London. Again, the different ethnic groups in Detroit would put their mark. This is the Italian community. The statue is in Belle Isle, and it was recently refurbished and fixed. Similarly, there are statues of Schiller that were put up by the Germans that lived in Detroit, and Kosciuszko, and so on. There is some of this, I kind of like this building, although it's very vulgar, but it started with a very beautiful base done by a Chicago architect that did a lot of industrial buildings at the beginning of the century. And this was like the white bread place, where they made all that white bread that was eaten all over the Midwest. And then that hat is put on top, and those lights, and people go and spend a lot of money there, and it's one of the casinos that makes the most money. It's called Motor City Casino. And at one point, I would say 15, maybe 20 years ago, the city had the choice of putting 3 casinos, and that would increase the revenue to the city by something like $100 million, which was a huge amount, and the city was broke. So they took them. So now if we go to the neighborhoods far away, to where the real concentration of poverty exists, and we look at this, which is near I-94 is here. This is on the east side of Detroit. And this picture was taken in '91. And here is a sort of sale organized by a church. So then I went back there 25 years later, tried to take the same shot, and this is what I found. Similarly here, one of my great interests is just a friend of mine just says, why are you so interested in useless things? And, it's just, I am. So I'm very interested in the whole invention of things that were designed during a period of the last 50 years or maybe longer to sort of bring a city back. So architects would be brought in to Gary, Indiana, and say, here we get, and this is a factual number actually, in the late 60s. Here we have $170 million to invest in things like West Pocket Parks, lights, and so on. So here you see the investment on planters. See, 1, 2, 3 planters. So you go later, and this is what oh, there I get the light. Yeah. So this is what you see there, but you still can see the planters. There's, again, you see a barber shop. This is on Livernois, the name of the street. And it's often the investment that you can make has to do with paint, because it's the cheapest thing, and it brightens up things, and it makes them look like they're alive. So that's like 2003. This is how I find out about things, because they usually put a phone number there. The painter puts a phone number, and 1 out of 10 will answer your calls. So this is what it looks like now. And here we see the big ruins, the sort of large scale. This is the Packard plant. First picture is 1991. The idea there was that the city was going to create this Motor City Industrial Park where 40,000 people work during World War II. They were going to have, instead of having one big corporation, there was going to be 200 or 300, each one of them employing maybe 80 or 100 people, so things were going to even out. Well, that never happened. There were many uses for the place, but they were usually, it's like you would drive a car there and strip it inside, or you would keep cardboard, or the largest legitimate business that ever was there was a laundry, an industrial laundry. And then it kind of, for a while it was used for raves. People would communicate using beepers, and they would congregate, and they had lights and music, and of course, throughout the whole period, you had the strippers that took you can see it beginning the strippers are beginning to do their work. This is like 98. This is like 2005. And this is now when a Spanish entrepreneur has bought it and of course went to Kinko's and put the sign out there, which is, and also you put the billboard here, you can see it, it has the classic Packard cars. But you can see that the work of the scavengers has continued, and more of the place is crumbling. I don't know what is going to happen to it. It's a massive place. It's about a mile and a half long. Again, this is another one, and you see then about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, Detroit just started being in the news all the time, and kids realized that if they tagged buildings in Detroit, a lot of people were going to see it, and pictures were going to be taken of them, and they would see their pictures on television and movies and different things. So you can see some of the most famous one is a guy called Gasp that you'll see afterwards. More recently, they began to fly model airplanes, so you can see the whole interior of that factory. If you go to YouTube, you can see that. It's called Continental Motors, and it was one of the largest makers of automobile motors. In Detroit, they also made airplane motors. There were these ruins that also fascinated me, because when I was growing up, I thought this was the future. And here I was in Detroit seeing that my idea of the future was already a ruin. And it kind of, it puzzled me and disturbed me. But also you could see, most of these pictures I have sequences, but because of the time I haven't been able to put them in sequence. You can see that this was a tire dealership, that many of the models were built they were designed by architects during a period, during World War II, when there was very little building going on in America. So they thought of the future, and they thought of the buildings that were going to keep people in the city. They wouldn't move out to the suburbs, because the cities were going to be so modern, progress was going to be everywhere, and buildings like this would be all over. So it was a dream. Again, there was another type of buildings that came much before, like in the 30s, 20s and 30s, and that is like a chain of restaurants, so fast food restaurants would start. This one started in Wisconsin, and then they moved to Detroit, and they do 30 of them all at once. So here is one left, and this is like the last the last little bit of life that still goes on there. And of course, by this time, the movies have discovered Detroit. And of course, this was shot in a movie called 8 Mile with a rapper called Eminem. He's seen there shooting at the head of the steer. And of course, there's that sort of the Night of the Living Dead and the whole story that zombies live in Detroit. And, you know, that's a picture to prove it. And it's right near the River Rouge plant. I began to notice certain things which I had documented in Camden, and that was one abandoned house tied into an occupied house. And then I made a point to go back and see, well, what would happen here? You know, and in this case, you see the occupied house, they fence themselves. But of course, they don't have any protection if there's a fire here and so on. So that's another example of the same thing. And there were this extremely dramatic way in which houses collapse. I mean, you just, it would look like they were staged almost. And here, this incredible story of that person hanging on there in that place, putting the flag out and the fence. It's a sad story, but it's a real story. And I do want to go there. And then there's the use of the empty space, which is a church that is right on the side. Very hot day in Detroit. They decide, well, you know, we'll have service outside. And then to attract people, they're frying sausages there. And then the people that walk by help themselves to a sausage and have to listen to a little bit of Christianity. One of my interests that I have kept for a really long time has been trying to answer the question, you know, of the creation in visual terms and also architecture, or, you know, making of things in areas of extreme segregation, and particularly in a place like Detroit, where most of the residents of those areas came from states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. It was the American South. A case which is sort of interesting because it existed in New York, but then it didn't, because you get West Indians, you get Nigerians, Kenyans, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and it was like a melting pot of minorities in places like East New York. And even in the most segregated place, in my opinion, which was Brownsville, you can see a lot of Latinos have moved into the public housing there. But that situation does not exist in Detroit, does not exist in big chunks of Chicago. And there, on those 50 years, there's been a visual culture that has developed, of which this is an example. And that's an example too. So Jesus goes with his cross to northern Michigan. and this is another example. And here is a dance school. And that's a place that serves food. Of course, all of these things disappear really quickly. And all that's left are these pictures. And that's one of the things that makes me happy that they're there at the Library of Congress. Of course, I have people that say, well, you know, what kind of an achievement is to paint that? I have no answer to that. So part of that were more ambitious projects that sort of would try to tell the whole history of being African American and living in a place like Detroit, and that history starts with the pyramids here and moves on to slavery here. Mandela gets put with slavery, and this very muscular folk saying, we are kings and queens and that whole thing. And then you go into the civil rights movement here, and of course you get Malcolm X, much bigger than Martin Luther King, which is tiny. And then of course you get the mayor of Detroit, who is Coleman Young, there with his achievements. And for some reason in Detroit, the Renaissance Center is seen as an achievement of the Coleman administration. So it makes it into the local barber shops, it makes it into a number of places where you wouldn't expect it, because it, to what degree does that represent black culture? I don't know. People just take it and adopt it. And the same thing is true of the people mover that you can see here. So this is a detail, and this is a detail that shows the slave and all the faces of the other slaves there. Again, this is another composition, and yeah, I found several of them, where people use the symbols of the city. That's Joel Lewis's fist here. That's the Renaissance Center, of course, the American flag and the eagle. And here's Coleman Young, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, and the two athletes that stood in the '67 Mexican Olympics.
John Carlos and Tommy Smith.
Yeah, you know the names. Yeah. Well, and but I guess what interests me is the idea of what symbols do you put together to say I'm that, and in what order and what prominence. Again, here is a lady that I actually met who was very offended by that abandoned house in a place at the front of her house, and she commissioned someone to say, look, paint this religious scenes. I like to stress religion because then we're going to see some examples of the work that is being brought by gentrifiers and by people who are going to using the walls of Detroit as canvases, because Detroit gets so much attention that if you put your mural in a well-trafficked street, it may end up in the New York Times the next day. So this is another extraordinary thing that is in the back of my book. And I just don't know how someone can put so much emotion into something that looks so easy. And so, I mean, the back of this story is what if these people would have had great art schools to go to? What would they have contributed? What would they have done for us? What kind of buildings they would have built? It ended up here, maybe, I don't know, but it could have been different. Again, it's another example. Somebody homeless walks by the garage and says, "Look, you'd like for me to paint your business," and of course he paints it, and it's a whole history of transportation. I think this would have been an extremely interesting exhibit in a folk art museum, but they could not take the whole building and put it in a folk art museum, so it's just doesn't exist anymore. Again, in that situation of extreme segregation, you have a daycare center and everybody's black. So what do you do with Snow White? So you paint her. So here it was first green, and then she was brown. And of course you go and ask, because you think this is a great statement on race in America, and then you figure that you're going to have them tell you, a big elaborate reason for doing this. He says, no, the kids like it, they think it's chocolate. Had nothing to do with race.
Yeah.
Young people are ingenious. They get 39,000 bus stops are missing in Detroit. So there's nowhere, I guess you've seen, that there's, you wait for the buses go like you know, you got to wait half an hour for a bus, so that's normal. So you just invent something to sit on. And of course, this embarrassed the city to no end. This is on Mack Avenue, which is still a well-traveled street, and you know, of course, it lasted a short time. I haven't seen it there anymore. And then there's like what I call Detroit New Architecture. And, and what happens is that you have two ethnic groups that have been in Detroit for almost 100 years. One longer than the other. The Greeks longer, the Albanians a shorter time. And somehow they've been able to have all these fast food businesses that blacks like. They like to go there and they like to eat their stuff. So these two groups get usually a building that used to be a franchise, something else, you know, and one of the big national franchises. And then they give it a completely different look by putting these big hats made out of a material called drive-it. Here you have another example. This is any kids, I'll remember. But this is the giveaway, because you see them in White Castle. And of course the architects are very interested in making a contribution to this. So there are students in an architecture school called Cranbrook decided that as a graduation thing they were going to do a building that was going to be a prototype building, and that was going to be like the new type of housing that was going to be built in Detroit where people were going to live. Well, what happened is that somebody lived there for about 6 months. The whole area was terrible. I mean, you can see by the burnt building, huge abandoned space. There used to be a school around there, and then the school was demolished. And then several years passed. Of course, it was used by tigers, by Tyree Guyton, which is a famous artist from Detroit that used to mark the abandoned buildings with a dot. And then time passed, and of course, this place is near Eastern Market, which is an area of Detroit that never really went down the tubes, and it's coming back and being regenerated. So this is the area next to it. So it's an area that of course they think an Airbnb is what belongs there. So how is it done? You get some muralist from Brooklyn that travels there and does his work. Red Bull, I think, pays for it, and the area is there. And next, you expect that all that big empty lot would be full of new houses or development. Here is a sort of different story, but here I'm playing the other side of those pictures that we saw with the T-bone steak and with the religious pictures and the pictures of the history. So what you see is that a muralist from Houston called Next died, and he had done work in Detroit, he had done work in Philadelphia, in Houston, in many other places. Some of them achieve a certain fame and reputation. They start their own line of clothing, and some of them are liked, and he was very well liked. His signature was in the museum in Detroit called Mocha. And then they make a New Zealander, comes all the way from New Zealand to build his portrait, to put him there. And what he's doing is he's opening a bottle of champagne before going out, like at 2 in the morning, to, you know, just put his signature on some billboards and climb into abandoned buildings and so on and so forth. So that's there's a certain style of the rough, the muralists that can take it, but they also live a very, they live a good life, and then their parents, of course, they all think that look at what my kid's doing now. He should be in law school. But then they surprise their parents because they have a show in London and a show in Amsterdam. So that's what that is. So what happens is that the city, of course, they see the knife and they say, you can't put a knife because the crime rate is very high. So the lady that owns the building had to hire somebody to paint over. This is because it's on the cover of my book, but this is the first incarnation of it. The person that put this is near the train station, and at one point I had the theory of development by ruin. So Detroit was going to have, like, the Coliseum was going to be the station, the train station, and it kind of almost happened that way. And the packet plant was going to be like something else, but nothing happened around the packet plant until now. So somebody from New Jersey moves there called Jerry Paffendorf, huge guy, and his grandmother gives him $500 or $1,000, and he buys 2 houses there. He immediately calls them the Imagination Station, gets somebody to do this mural, and then of course the building burns. He starts selling land by the inch. There's all this in the internet. He gets quite a bit of money selling land by the inch. Then this is the cover of my book. But of course, it burns and still keeps some of the old stuff. And then you get Shepard Fairey that comes to Detroit to do this huge mural for Gilbert. But at night, Shepard Fairey goes outlaw. So he goes to the neighborhoods to put his tags and stuff, which is the tag for the clothing line. So you can, I've seen people wearing this Obey clothing. So now Shepard Fairey is not wanted in Detroit. He's going to be arrested if he shows up. And even more bizarre, these are 4 female designers from Holland that decide that they want to leave their mark in Detroit. Up to this point, you know, they're being limited to sort of the old colonies of Holland. So they would go to Suriname and some of these other places, but they say, well, we should go to Detroit. Mm-hmm. And they had an idea, and that's what, that's a part of the incredible thing, is that you could think things and then carry them out in Detroit. Detroit was like a free space for, to put these amazing things. So they go all over the city trying to convince the ministers that they should put Detroit wherever they put God. So they say God saves, they should put Detroit saves, and so on. Of course, they didn't have any success. And they were about to give up, and they went to a service in this church. It's an old church. And the minister spoke about, God is no dry bones, God, you should live. And of course, they asked the minister if they could do this, and they did it, and they gave me a title for the book. So here you have another one of those buildings that was designed, and here again I'm guessing in the 40s, and then put there to show the new architecture that was going to beautify the city. But you know, about 5-6 years ago, you had Banksy in Detroit that's leaving his mark there, and he put one of his works here, which of course lasted about 24 hours, and then this big hole on the wall there. If you go back and see it, you can see it on Google Streets. Also, that tremendous antagonism that existed at one point between the city and the political establishment in the city and the suburbs. You know, there's a little book called Sayings of Coleman Young. You can see it, you get a sense that things were really, people would, you know, that had grown up in Detroit wouldn't come to the city for anything and any reason. that situation changed completely because the whole ruling class of the city is now white. So you get the 3 billionaires, you get the mayor, you get all the people, entrepreneurs and so on, and foundation executives, big foundations executives, and they are part of, none of them is African American. So what happens then is that the suburban surroundings of Detroit find it much easier to go into the city because they don't get called names and stuff. So there are projects, like a couple of years ago I was there, and there were 30,000 Lutherans picking up garbage along streets like Micah Avenue. It was just like the most extraordinary thing. They would get together in the stadium, in the basketball stadium, and they would say their prayers, and then they would go out and board up houses and stuff. Starbucks sends like 1,000 people for a weekend. Ford sends 3,000 or 4,000. General Motors does the same. And they do this picking up stuff, mowing the lawn, picking up the tires, sealing up houses. But this case, this was in an area called Brightmoor. This was done by a group of people from a church in Illinois that came in, and there was an art student there that, of course, brought her images and put them on the streets, and then, of course, the neighborhood would much rather have them give money or give something else, but if they wanted to paint the house as well, that was fine. So that's another one. And this is Tyree and his work. His work that was left there, and it was there for a long time until it became. He became famous. He was in the Venice Biennale and other things, and then somebody figured that they were going to make money selling these figures, and they were all over, So the bus was hijacked and taken, and left. And there are the folks that want to regain those spaces that are taken by the tigers and by the people who come from far away. So they want on the walls what really belongs there. So Rosa Parks lived in Detroit for the last years, and there she is. There is a view, and I think I was always looking for this kind of thing, sort of the alternative view of the city, where the great monuments like the GM building, the GM building, which is here, and I think this is the Penobscot building. And then in front, you have the local funeral home, where most blacks, most prominent blacks go to be buried, and then the Motown Museum. So it's like trying to equalize, and that's the Motown Museum. And here again, you can see a group of those people that are the foundation, the business people that get a free day to go and help in Detroit. And they're creating a park. And these are the folks that kind of invent those spaces that are so extraordinary. I mean, you get variations of this all over the country, but I think Detroit goes farther. And it's an old warehouse space, industrial space, that was an art gallery for Wayne State for a period. And then it was taken by a lesbian couple that moved in. And of course, all the signs are handmade. Then there are pieces of buildings that I used to just put there as decoration. And then there are the chairs, they're all taken from the schools that have been destroyed or abandoned. I sort of contrast them with this because there were always, even at the worst times in Detroit, there were always sort of white folks that never left. So they sort of were almost, you know, they would look across and all they knew is that the person in front of you wanted a hamburger or a plate of soup or something. And this was an example of that. Except that now they are in that area that the hockey stadium is right there, and the whole area is being redeveloped, and the place has been closed, partly because they're very old. And they had to hold on to the what you call it, the table there, so they wouldn't fall. Again, Detroit is full of people who plant things and grow things. There's a, you know, maybe you could put Manhattan in the empty space in Detroit. Again, it's from a courthouse. It's a side of one of those decorations by a local artist. His name was Corrado Verducci, and it kind of there is this desire of the Detroit of power, of the Detroit of money, of the, you know, which you see expressed here as they carry all that stack of money, and they're busy there. You know, I'm sure they're accountants looking at money. They are not reading Shakespeare there. So, and here is my last picture at the train station. And this was a story. We could just talk for a long time about that building. It was built in 1913. The president went there. Lots of people went there to take the train to war, go to war, and they put new windows on it, with a new roof, and but they still have no idea what to do with it. So I'm talked out. I hope that I didn't see anybody leave. So, but I don't know what you say, boss.
Are there some questions for Camilo?
What led you to start this 30-year, and it was actually longer than 30 years, so I remember you back in, I think, the late 70s.
Yeah.
So what led you to go on this journey?
Well, you know, it's just, it's sort of instinct. It's just, my family was rich, it had a lot of stuff, and then my father lost everything, so I used to see, you know, the dining room table go away and all of that stuff. So, you know, I'm in Detroit, that made an impression. I couldn't leave those pictures. They're always in my head, so even if somebody gave me $1 million, I would feel, you know, that everything is going to crumble anyway. So I was in Detroit, or I was in Gary, Indiana, or I was in all those places, and of course they resonated with me in a very personal way, and you know, I just couldn't stop but photographing them, asking the question always, you know, what's going to happen to this next? And I'm sort of glad that I did that, because it was not predictable.
What do you think is
fascinating? I'm so glad you're here. I hope we have a chance to talk personally. I'm Jack Eichenbaum. I arrived at the University of Michigan in 1967 to do a PhD in urban geography. It was a week after the Detroit riots in 1967, which was also the same summer that there were riots in Newark. And in fact, the story that you're telling about Detroit could also be told similarly in the South Bronx and in Newark, which things are happening pretty much at the same time. But I will just mention one thing. Are you familiar with an exhibit called Detroit Disassembled?
Yeah,
it was at the Queens Museum about 5 years ago. I gave a talk in conjunction with that. And it was a photography exhibit, very much like yours. And I remember one photo that was really stunning to me. There was a high school, kind of like our Bronx High School of Science or Stuyvesant. It was called Cass Tech. It was a
Cass
Aztec. And that was the elite public high school for people interested in science. And here was this building, and ivy was growing inside the building in that exhibit. So you've heard of that exhibit?
Yeah, I mean, I know him. I know Andrew. And I had an exhibit with him at the National Building Museum. So we were together. Except that it took me a much longer time to finish that book. Go ahead.
Really appreciate the photography that you capture from the past to the present or the present to past. To me, it's kind of like an industry can really build a society, take it down instantly. So you photograph looking at the kid playing, in the hot summer with all the fountain, the fire hydrant, and then the picture that took after that is all become green. So you're kind of going to the future. I mean, going back to the past instead of the future. But I'm an urban designer, master planning. So to me, that have a lot of hope. The reason is the nature of you're going to take over what left by unbuilt, undone space to turn green. And then the next step is, I think, is better off for a better future. That nature kind of halfway done for you. In a way, bring the green back to the city. And then next step is, I think, is more sensible, I think, for development. So with that, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
What are the future planning for the city of Detroit in terms of the government help to sort of bring the Detroit back for another kind of industry, or what are they thinking?
It's hard. I mean, one thing I didn't mention, which is very, very interesting, I think it's sort of implied by some of the pictures that you saw there, is that Detroit became some sort of a capital of authenticity. And authenticity has become like a great capital. So you have companies like Shinola that go there. John Varvatos is there. And then there are some other ones, maybe smaller companies, but nothing to offset the loss of some of the big industry that was in place. So there is a core of people, and there are many white college graduates that are moving there. For some reason, black gentrifiers are a very rare breed. I have no idea why, but they'll rather live in the suburbs or some other place. And they seem to be highly motivated to do things like, we want to make the best pizza in the world, and they're serious about it. Or the best sandwich, or the best coffee. I mean, nobody knew the word sommelier in Detroit 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
That's right.
Now it's just very common. And coffee, you get all kinds of coffee. But that again, it's sort of an unequal and a separate development that is not spreading. The only thing that is happening in some large way in the neighborhoods is planting, the sort of greening that you mentioned before.
What do you think is helpful?
But that will not, the city would not feed itself on that. I mean, it's a woman with some children living in a block, and the only house in the block or two houses in the block, it's very bleak.
Yeah, the development stuff, as you're going, there's some practice guy, Dan Gilbert, who runs Quicken Loans. He mentioned him several times. He's buying up a lot of stuff. So in certain very pocketed corridors, there's this real estate development, but the vast majority of the city is not touched by that.
Go ahead.
I read a Times article that there's like a tourist industry grown up around touring these decayed buildings. Is that true? Is it like a thing, people from Europe visiting Detroit to see the ruins?
Well, I think one thing that made possible this, gentrification and the organization of gentrification and the way that they could operate in safety there in Detroit was that they were all very internet savvy. So they could communicate. You go online and you find out, if you move by bicycle, you can immediately know what streets to avoid and so on and so forth. And yes, there is a kind of industry of people that take people for tours, but it's not a big one. It's not a significant one. People are still the most things that they are the most interested in are things like sports. So it's the sports clubs, things that really come out. Go ahead.
Is there a particular resource you would recommend for someone not familiar with the city who might want to visit?
If one wants to visit? You mean like a hotel or a restaurant?
No, a practical resource of,
Google Streets. No, I'm not kidding. I'm just look, buy a copy of my book and put all the addresses
I
there.
guess that's what I meant. I mean, is that intended to be something that one could?
Well, my father used to call me a peculiar person. So maybe you don't share my views, but you've heard, and everything there has an address. You can always, you can go to the place and see what is around it. And, maybe you'll find something, you can tailor your visit to yourself. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so you said that when they built the sort of makeshift bus stop, the city got rid of it. Did they end up building actual benches there?
Well, you see, Detroit is the land of opportunity because the moment you start a project, you can get it in papers all over the place. It's like there were some kids at Wayne State that decided they were going to put benches, for people waiting for the bus. So not only put benches, but because people may take the wood that they make the benches with, that they welcome. It says, look, if you want to take the wood, just take it. Well, you look at the numbers. They built 20 benches. This was like a year ago. They need 3,900. But that got those kids, written up in the Wall Street Journal and everywhere else, So these other benches, it's another story. This guy didn't get written up, but I'm in his case. I want everybody to recognize. He probably didn't build that, but he's enjoying the fruits of somebody else's labor. In other places I've seen, and here is something that was really interesting, is the chair that you can buy, that you can put out, and nobody will take the trouble to steal. So there is a plastic chair you can buy for $5, so that you can put out there and you can sit and wait for the bus. So I think there's a whole history here of things that people do when things get rough. And I think they've been the recording of those things. It has not been sort of promoted and encouraged. Go ahead.
Hi. Are there any growing new immigrant communities in Detroit? Neighborhoods where immigrants have arrived maybe in the past 10 years?
Mexicans have been around for a while. There's also the Bangladeshis, but they went mostly to Hamtramck, which is a closed area.
Lebanese and others, but they're actually outside the boundary of Detroit. They're in Dearborn.
And the Arabs are moving out. A lot of their businesses are closing, so they're moving to the suburbs.
And how far is Dearborn from?
I'm sorry, what?
How far is Dearborn from?
You just
Detroit?
ran
right
into it.
next
You
to
take
Next on the
Michigan
border,
Avenue
it's
and go
against
there.
the self-founded.
It seems, and maybe it's just my perspective because they're all just photographs, but it seems like a lot of these efforts to invest in Detroit are very isolated and separate, and I'm wondering if there's any, if people are coming together to actually come up with a plan for the future, because it doesn't seem like this will make any difference or make any big change.
Well, there are people are coming together in that core. It's kind of, I mean, if you want to sing the praises of it, you can. I mean, there's some extraordinary things. There are, any number of restaurants where there was hardly any at one point. There are many hotels that have sprung up, bed and breakfast. You are in places where you feel very good in Detroit, but it's not spreading, and that's like the tragedy of it.
So, in the bankruptcy, part of the deal was to have a plan going forward. Like if you're going to reorganize a company, you had to actually have a plan about how the company. So if you go to the bankruptcy report, they have a plan out there. A lot of it is centered on the dreams and hopes of these billionaires, especially Dan Gilbert, who actually runs Quicken Loans, which is famous for high interest loans to poor people.
Sure.
Right?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you see your art as activism or as just archives, perhaps of activism? But
every once in a while there's an article somewhere that says that there's a bar and there are black militants are getting together and sort of saying that this is not, that something has to be done to stop this or to spread development or to do something. But I don't think, I don't know. What I can tell you is just that, I'll keep going and I'll keep seeing what's the next version of what's developing. To me, it caught me by surprise to see this interest of the churches and the what you call it, the big corporations, to sort of set people loose, and they actually, you should see them. It's full. The internet is full of this kind of thing. You get the president of General Motors, coming in and encouraging everybody that's doing this kind of thing, which is, to some degree, it's beautiful. They built a gym in 3 days or something. They get the best of American technology and engineers, and they work like, miracles, but you wish that this would happen in a larger scale, and that the lives of people who need decades, to become members, in the same way that the gentrifiers can become members. That's not happening.
Go ahead, maybe one more question.
No, I was just wondering, in the bankruptcy plan, what is the idea of rebuilding what's the central idea of the rebuilding?
Go ahead.
It's, well, a lot of it is that Dan Gilbert is buying up all the land in the central city, and there's a hope that the hockey stadium.
That's Illich.
And Illich and then a light rail train down.
Sure.
Woodward. It's a little bit fantastical, but I'm not an expert, but it is a little bit fantastical. But a lot of realtors' hopes are. There isn't a big idea, actually.
The problem is that Detroit is 40 square miles.
That's it.
It's enormous. And so when it was reasonably prosperous and middle class and lower middle class, it had individual houses spread over such a vast area. And that cannot be maintained.
Right.
And that is...
It has to be shrunk.
It has to be shrunk by population and have hubs, little commercial hubs, and then they're trying to figure out what to do with the land in between. but they still don't have the basic idea of the economic engine. What is going to drive the jobs? They don't have that. No, it's a wonderful document.
So I hope you're all going to buy a book, and in addition, you can ask further questions, and you can do it with a glass of wine or water in your hand, because we have a reception over there, and you can find your books here. And I think we should all thank Camilo for the work.
Happy
It's great. I see a lot of familiar faces, but if there's anyone here who has not been to the museum before? Anyone? Oh, good. Well, welcome to your first time. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum, and we've been here since 2004, and it's Camilo's first time in the States. But as I'm going to introduce him in a second, first I'll tell you
I didn't have money to pay for the ticket.
This is so relevant to my remarks that I'm going to make when I introduce you. But so I've known Camilo for, as I discovered from the Wikipedia entry on you, and let me put in a plug for Wikipedia, because if anybody's using the site this week, it says that if everybody who is on Wikipedia at this moment that you're reading this gave $3, their fundraising would be over for this year. So, and I always give, so everybody should give as well. And speaking of giving, if you want to be a member of the Skyscraper Museum, we have plenty of sign-up sheets out there, or you can do it on our website. But if you do it here tonight and you buy a book, you also get a member's discount of 15% on the book. So it would be well worth our low membership price. So here at the museum, we do an author's talk every month. And we like to range on topics that go from New York City history to skyscrapers worldwide, and all topics of urbanism. So appropriately, our talk tonight about Detroit, which is the great skyscraper city, and in the aptly subtitled The Eternal City of the Industrial Age, for Detroit's no dry bones. Detroit is one of the, Kathleen, you want to sit in front? Wherever you like. Just here, just in time. Detroit is, one of the great American cities, and more in the now 50-year-old rubric of the death and life of great American cities. And I think maybe the life that Jane Jacobs speaks about, Camilo may have detected a few traces of that we're going to see in his work tonight. For those of you who don't know Camilo's work and haven't known him for, as I discovered from Wikipedia, probably 28 years or so since I first met you back at Columbia, because Camilo, who is a great photographer and a great journalist of cities and sociologist of cities, has done a number of books, of which I'm just going to name a few. But the very first one, and when I first met Camilo, they published in 1989, was Silent Cities, which was a study of cemeteries. And for that, he collaborated with Kenneth Jackson, the urban historian at Columbia, and a friend and colleague of both of ours. And that's when I first met Camilo. And I knew at that point that he had been documenting American cities like, New York and the South Bronx in particular, and Newark and Camden, over a period of time. And I guess you'll talk about that, but it's more than 30 years, this idea of going back to a place over and over again. And what is now called re-photography, and is a genre of photography that often replicates from the same position at another time through history, the same photograph over. It's often of another photographer's work. It's of Bernice Abbott. One thinks of the way Doug Levere went back and re-photographed. But Camilo has been re-photographing his own photographs for the span of nearly 30 years, which ends up being an extraordinary historical record. And that has been recognized by, for example, the Library of Congress, and you have a collection there. Mari Nagahara says hello, and she asked me to mention that your photographs are in the architecture collection of the Library of Congress. And also the Getty, is that right? Do I remember correctly?
They have a few.
Okay, so his work has been much collected by important repositories. And because I wanted to mention some of the other books, in 1995, The New American Ghetto. In 1999, American Ruins, which is about Detroit. And there were multiple other ones, but in 2013, he turned to Harlem. Another thing I learned from Wikipedia, and this really blew my mind, that Kodachrome was only invented in 1974.
No, that was the Kodachrome high speed, I think 64. Before it was only 25, the speed, and you couldn't, if you went there in a dark day, you couldn't hold the camera.
Oh, okay. Well, I feel better and I don't feel quite as old learning that. But nevertheless, apparently what Wikipedia says is that Kodachrome 64 inspired the idea that you could capture inaccurate living color some of the time.
You could use a small camera and then, you could take it anywhere you wanted. You could photograph fast. You didn't have to set it up in a tripod and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm.
And that was in 1974, that technological breakthrough came. And all the while, he's taking these photographs. In 2002, in 1999, he had his first exhibition, major exhibition at a museum, at the National Building Museum, and that traveled to other places. In 2002, he was named a MacArthur Fellow, in other words, a MacArthur Genius. And I have to say, all academics were enormously envious of people who have been named a MacArthur Fellow. I had to feel good for you because, as you just alluded to, Camilo really needed the money. That's another story of his life. He really needed the money. So it was really a delight to know that Camilo got his large grant in the MacArthur Award for 5 years running, which I'm sure took you more than 5 years on the road of continuing this project. He also received a Berlin Prize in 2010 at the American Academy in Berlin, and in 2012 a National Humanities Award, which was given to him by President Barack Obama. So we're very lucky tonight to have the photographer himself telling us about his work. Camilo.